The rotors were still spinning when Colonel Marcus Thorne stepped out of the Black Hawk, desert dust swirling around his boots like angry spirits. Forward Operating Base Kalsu stretched before him in the Iraqi heat, a collection of concrete barriers and prefab buildings that had become home to 3,000 souls fighting a war most Americans had forgotten. But Thorne wasn't thinking about politics or public opinion. He was thinking about the fuel gauge that had been dancing dangerously close to empty for the last 40 minutes of their reconnaissance flight. The refueling station sat at the edge of the landing zone, a simple concrete pad with underground tanks and above-ground pumps. Nothing remarkable, except for the figure in desert camouflage who moved with the fluid precision of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before. Thorne watched as she connected the fuel line to his aircraft with movements that seemed almost choreographed. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just pure competence wrapped in regulation battle dress. Something nagged at him as he approached the refueling station. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, shoulders straight despite the 120-degree heat. Maybe it was how the other soldiers gave her a wide berth, not out of disrespect, but with the kind of deference usually reserved for senior NCOs or officers. She couldn't have been more than 5'6", but she commanded the space around her like she owned it. "Fuel's flowing smooth, sir," she called out without looking up from the gauge. Her voice carried the slight rasp that came from breathing too much desert sand and helicopter exhaust. "Should have you topped off in 15 mics." Thorne nodded, but his eyes had found what his subconscious had been searching for. There, on her right sleeve, partially obscured by the angle of her arm and the desert tan fabric, was an insignia that made him stop breathing for just a moment. Not the standard Air Force wings he'd expected, not even the Army aviation badge that would have made sense for someone working the flight line. This was different. This was something that shouldn't exist on a fuel technician's uniform, something that told a story he suddenly realized he needed to hear. The insignia was small, subdued, the kind of thing most officers would miss in passing. But Marcus Thorne had spent 23 years in the military, had flown with the best pilots the Army had to offer, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. The question that burned in his mind wasn't what the insignia meant. He knew that all too well. The question was how someone wearing those wings had ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, fueling his helicopter like she was just another mechanic. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of JP-8 fuel and something else, the weight of secrets that demanded to be told. The fuel pump clicked off with mechanical finality, but Colonel Thorne made no move toward his aircraft. Instead, he found himself studying the woman more carefully, noting details he'd missed in his initial assessment. Her hands, steady as a surgeon's despite the heat shimmer rising from the concrete. Her stance, balanced and alert in a way that suggested combat training far beyond what any fuel technician would need. And most telling of all, the way her eyes swept the horizon in systematic intervals. Not the casual glance of someone watching for trouble, but the methodical scan of someone who had learned to read the sky for threats. "That's an interesting piece of hardware you're wearing, Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice carrying just enough command authority to make it clear this wasn't a casual observation. He gestured toward her sleeve with the kind of precision that came from years of pointing at map coordinates and target designations. She straightened slightly, and for the first time since he'd been watching her, something flickered across her face. Not fear exactly, but the guarded wariness of someone who had learned that certain conversations led to certain consequences. "Sir." "Your wings." The words hung in the desert air between them like a challenge. "Those aren't standard issue for fuel operations." For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the distant rumble of generators, the metallic tick of cooling aircraft engines, and somewhere in the distance, the call to afternoon prayer drifting across the base from the local village. Then she reached up with her left hand, almost unconsciously, and touched the insignia as if to verify it was still there. "Ancient history, sir," she said, but there was something in her voice now, not quite defiance, but not quite resignation either. Something that suggested the history wasn't nearly as ancient as she wanted it to be. Just doing my job now. But Thorne had spent too many years reading people, reading situations, reading the spaces between what was said and what was meant. This woman wasn't just doing her job. She was hiding from something, or someone was hiding her. And that insignia on her sleeve wasn't just ancient history, it was a story that needed telling, whether she wanted to tell it or not. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the concrete into a shimmering oven that baked everything it touched. Sweat beaded on Thorne's forehead despite the moisture-wicking fabric of his flight suit, but he didn't move toward the shade of his helicopter. Something about this moment felt important, like standing at the edge of a cliff where you could either step back to safety or leap forward into the unknown. "What's your name, Sergeant?" he asked, though he already knew he could find it on duty rosters and personnel files. Sometimes the asking was more important than the knowing. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Thorne heard volumes. This wasn't someone who forgot her own name or rank. This was someone deciding how much truth to reveal to a colonel she'd never met, in a war zone where the wrong word to the wrong person could reshape a career or end it entirely. "Vasquez," she said finally, "Technical Sergeant Alina Vasquez." But even as she said it, Thorne caught the slight emphasis on the rank, the way she seemed to be reminding herself as much as informing him. Like someone who had once answered to something else entirely, in places where sergeants didn't usually go and doing things sergeants didn't usually do. The pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind, forming a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see completely. Because if he was right about what those wings represented, then Alina Vasquez wasn't just hiding from ancient history. She was hiding from a present that had decided she was too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too inconvenient to be trusted with the kind of responsibility those wings implied. And if that was true, then every moment she stood here in the Iraqi sun, fueling helicopters and pretending to be just another enlisted mechanic, was both a waste of extraordinary talent and a story of institutional failure that went all the way to the Pentagon. The thought made him angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Captain Maya Rodriguez emerged from the operations center with the kind of purposeful stride that usually meant someone was about to have their day complicated. She was Thorne's intelligence officer, a sharp-eyed West Point graduate who had earned her reputation by seeing patterns others missed and asking questions others avoided. But as she approached the refueling station, her eyes weren't on the colonel. They were fixed on Technical Sergeant Alina Vasquez with an expression that suggested recognition. "Sir," Rodriguez said as she reached them, her voice carrying that carefully neutral tone that intelligence officers used when they were about to deliver information that would change everything. "We need to discuss the mission parameters for tomorrow's reconnaissance flight." But her eyes never left Vasquez, and Thorne caught the subtle tension that passed between the two women. Not hostility, exactly, but the kind of charged atmosphere that came from shared knowledge neither was supposed to acknowledge. "The flight can wait, Captain," Thorne said. "Right now I'm more interested in understanding how one of our fuel technicians ended up wearing aviator wings that haven't been issued to active personnel in over 3 years." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Somewhere in the distance, a convoy rumbled past the base perimeter, raising a cloud of dust that obscured the horizon. But here, in this small circle of concrete and jet fuel, 3 people stood locked in a moment that felt like the fulcrum on which larger events would turn. Rodriguez glanced at Thorne, then back at Vasquez, and he could see her making calculations behind her eyes. Professional calculations about classified information and need-to-know protocols. Personal calculations about loyalty and justice, and what happened to good people caught in the gears of institutional machinery. "Perhaps," Rodriguez said carefully, "this conversation should continue somewhere more private, sir." But Vasquez was already shaking her head, her jaw set with the kind of determination that Thorne had seen in combat pilots facing impossible odds. "No need for privacy, ma'am. Colonel wants to know about the wings. He can know about the wings. Nothing classified about failure." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut steel, and Thorne realized they had moved far beyond casual curiosity into territory where careers were made and broken, where the difference between hero and washout often came down to politics and perception rather than skill and courage. The heat shimmer rising from the concrete made everything look fluid and unstable, like the whole scene might dissolve and reform into something else entirely. But the woman standing before him, Technical Sergeant Elena Vasquez, was solid and real and carrying a weight that no fuel technician should have to bear. Those wings on her sleeve weren't just ancient history. They were a testament to dreams deferred, potential wasted, and institutional decisions that valued conformity over competence. And Colonel Marcus Thorne, 23 years in the Army, combat veteran of 3 wars, suddenly found himself facing a question that would define not just this conversation, but possibly the entire trajectory of the war they were fighting. What do you do when the system fails someone who never failed the system? The operations center hummed with the controlled chaos of military efficiency. Banks of monitors displayed satellite feeds, communication channels crackled with routine traffic, and staff officers moved between workstations with the practiced urgency of people fighting a war from behind computer screens. But in the small briefing room where Colonel Thorne had led them, silence reigned with almost oppressive weight. Technical Sergeant Elena Vasquez sat across from him at the scarred metal table, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that lined her face. Captain Rodriguez had positioned herself near the door, not blocking it, but close enough to control access to their conversation. The air conditioning unit rattled in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the desert heat that seemed to seep through the concrete walls like an inexorable tide. "Tell me about Kandahar," Thorne said quietly. No preamble, no gentle lead-in, just 4 words that hit Vasquez like a physical blow. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, something fundamental had changed in her expression. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest. "How much do you know, sir?" "I know that 3 years ago, you were Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, pilot in command of a US-60 Black Hawk, assigned to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I know that on March 15th, you were flying a classified mission in southern Afghanistan when something went very wrong. And I know that 6 months later, you were suddenly a technical sergeant working fuel operations at various forward bases." The words seemed to echo in the small room despite the soft hum of electronics and air conditioning. Rodriguez shifted slightly by the door, her intelligence officers training no doubt cataloging every micro-expression, every hesitation, every word that carried more weight than its literal meaning. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the metal table. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat affect of someone recounting events that had been analyzed and reanalyzed until they lost all emotional resonance. "We were extracting a high-value target from a compound near the Pakistani border. Intelligence said minimal resistance, in and out in 20 minutes. Clean operation." "But it wasn't clean," Thorne said. "It wasn't a question." "No, sir, it wasn't clean." Something flickered in her eyes, not quite a smile, but an expression that might have been one in better circumstances. Intelligence was wrong about the resistance. They were wrong about the terrain. They were wrong about the enemy's capabilities and their willingness to die defending that compound. But they weren't wrong about one thing: it was a high-value target. High enough that when everything went to hell, the decision was made to classify the entire operation so deep that officially, it never happened. The air conditioning unit gave a particularly violent rattle, as if protesting the weight of secrets being shared in its presence. Thorne leaned forward slightly, close enough to see the small scar that ran along Vasquez's left temple, the kind of scar that came from flying debris or shrapnel, not from routine maintenance accidents. "What really happened out there, Alina?" he asked, using her first name deliberately, trying to bridge the gap between colonel and sergeant, between official inquiry and human conversation. Her hands stilled on the table, and for a moment she looked younger than her 31 years. Young enough to be the lieutenant who had once believed that skill and courage and dedication were enough to overcome any obstacle the army could place in her path. "We saved them," she said simply. "All of them. The ground team, the high-value target, even the 2 wounded Afghan interpreters who weren't supposed to be there according to the mission brief. Brought everyone home alive despite taking heavy fire, despite mechanical failures, despite a landing zone that had been compromised and overrun by hostiles. Flew that damaged bird through a sandstorm with hydraulics failing and fuel running low. Landed her in a forward base that didn't even know we were coming, because communications had been jammed for the last 40 minutes of the flight." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, but it was tinged with something else. A sadness that spoke of victories that had become defeats, of heroism that had been reframed as liability. "So what went wrong?" Thorne asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He had seen enough of military politics to understand how success could be transformed into failure when the right people decided that success was inconvenient. "I improvised," Vasquez said, and the word hung in the air like an admission of guilt. "When the original plan fell apart and people were dying, I improvised. Made tactical decisions that weren't in the operations order. Took risks that weren't pre-approved by higher command. Violated about 15 different protocols and procedures while keeping everyone alive." Rodriguez moved slightly by the door, and Thorne caught her eye. The captain's expression was carefully neutral, but he could read the understanding there. This was a story they both knew, even if they had never heard this particular version of it. The story of competent people being punished for competence when that competence highlighted the inadequacy of those above them in the chain of command. "The after-action review was classified at the highest levels," Vasquez continued, her voice growing steadier as she moved deeper into the narrative. "Conducted by people who hadn't been there, hadn't seen what we saw, hadn't had to make the decisions we made in real time with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance. They focused on what I did wrong, not what I did right. On the procedures I violated, not the people I saved. On the risk I exposed the military to, not the mission I accomplished." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of institutional failure, of bureaucratic machinery that ground up good people in service of abstract principles and political considerations. Thorne had seen it before, but that didn't make it easier to witness. If anything, familiarity made it worse, because it meant the system was broken in predictable and preventable ways. Outside the briefing room, the war continued. Helicopters lifted off and landed. Convoys rolled through the desert, satellite dishes tracked their endless orbits overhead. But inside this small concrete box, 3 people confronted the reality that sometimes the greatest enemy wasn't the one shooting at you from across the battlefield, but the one evaluating your performance from behind a desk thousands of miles away. "They offered me a choice," Vasquez said, breaking the silence with words that carried the weight of finality. "Face a court-martial for violations of procedure and risk losing everything, including my military career and benefits, or accept administrative punishment, reduction in rank, and reassignment to non-flight duties. Keep my service record technically clean in exchange for never flying for the military again." Thorne felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew enough about military justice to understand the impossible position she had been placed in, forced to choose between fighting for vindication and risking total destruction, or accepting injustice to preserve some semblance of future stability. "You chose the certainty of limited punishment over the uncertainty of potential vindication," he said. "I chose to survive, sir," Vasquez replied, and there was no shame in her voice, only the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had learned that principle was a luxury she couldn't afford. I had people depending on me. Family who needed my benefits, fellow soldiers who needed to see that sometimes you could fight the system and walk away with something intact, even if it wasn't everything you wanted. Rodriguez spoke for the first time since they had entered the briefing room, her intelligence officers' training evident in the precision of her words. The official record shows Technical Sergeant Vasquez as a model soldier with exemplary performance ratings in her current assignment. No mention of previous flight experience or the circumstances that led to her reassignment. Clean slate, Thorne said, understanding the subtext. As if Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, pilot, never existed. As if she never should have existed in the first place, Vasquez corrected. And now there was bitterness in her voice, not self-pity, but anger at a system that had taken someone exceptional and tried to pretend she was ordinary. Turns out the military values predictability more than capability. Safer to have average pilots following orders exactly than exceptional pilots who might have to think for themselves when everything goes to hell. The truth of it settled over them like dust from a helicopter rotor wash, pervasive, gritty, impossible to ignore. Thorne had spent his career believing that merit would eventually triumph over politics, that competence would always find a way to surface and be recognized. But sitting across from Technical Sergeant Elena Vasquez, seeing the waste of talent and potential in her careful neutrality and buried pride, he realized how naive that belief had been. The war outside continued its relentless pace, but inside the briefing room, time seemed suspended. Three people confronting the reality that sometimes the system they served was its own worst enemy, capable of defeating itself more thoroughly than any external threat could manage. And Colonel Marcus Thorne, career military officer and true believer in institutional justice, found himself facing a choice that would define not just Elena Vasquez's future, but his own understanding of what it meant to serve with honor in a dishonorable situation. The decision, when it crystallized in his mind, felt both inevitable and terrifying in its implications. 2 days later, the morning briefing carried an unusual tension. Staff officers filed into the main conference room with the subdued alertness of people who sensed change coming, but couldn't quite identify its source. Colonel Thorne stood at the front of the room, his expression unreadable as he waited for the chatter to die down and attention to focus on the briefing boards that had been prepared overnight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. "We have a situation developing in Sector 7 that requires immediate attention and specialized capabilities." The sector map on the main screen showed a rugged area of desert and low hills approximately 60 kilometers southeast of their position. Red symbols marked known enemy positions, while blue indicators showed the locations of a 12-man reconnaissance team that had been conducting surveillance operations for the past 72 hours. At 04:30 this morning, Recon Team Bravo made contact with a previously unknown insurgent cell operating sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities in this region. Thorne continued, using a laser pointer to highlight specific coordinates on the map. Current intelligence suggests the insurgents have obtained at least 3 Russian-made surface-to-air missile systems, possibly more, along with trained operators and support personnel. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, her intelligence briefing materials organized with the precision that had made her invaluable to the battalion staff. "Sir, current threat assessment indicates these aren't the typical improvised explosive devices or small arms fire we've been encountering. These are military-grade systems capable of engaging aircraft at altitude and range. Standard insertion and extraction protocols may not be sufficient." The room fell silent as the implications settled in. Everyone present had flown enough missions over the past deployment to understand what sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities meant for helicopter operations. It meant longer routes, higher altitudes, modified tactics, and significantly increased risk for both aircrew and passengers. Recon Team Bravo is scheduled for extraction at 1400 hours, Thorne said, his words precise and measured. However, given the enhanced threat environment, normal extraction procedures are inadequate. This mission requires a pilot with specific experience in high-threat environments, someone capable of tactical improvisation under fire, and demonstrated ability to operate independently when communication is compromised. Major Harrison, the battalion's senior pilot, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was competent, experienced, and well-regarded, but everyone in the room knew his strengths lay in precision execution of standard procedures, not creative problem-solving under extreme stress. For this type of mission, competence might not be enough. "Sir," Harrison said carefully, "I can modify the standard extraction pattern to account for the surface-to-air threat. Approach from the north, low-level insertion, minimal time on ground." "Negative," Thorne replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. This mission requires capabilities beyond standard modification of existing procedures. It requires someone who has operated successfully in similar threat environments and demonstrated the judgment necessary to adapt tactics in real time when the situation changes. The silence in the room took on a different quality, not the comfortable quiet of people waiting for more information, but the charged atmosphere of people sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Thorne walked to the conference room door and opened it. "Technical Sergeant Vasquez, please join us." The collective intake of breath was audible as Elena Vasquez entered the briefing room. She wore her standard desert camouflage uniform, her technical sergeant stripes clearly visible, but something about her bearing had changed since Thorne's conversation with her 2 days earlier. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been asked to step back into a role she had never truly left behind, regardless of what her rank insignia might suggest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thorne announced, his words falling into the stunned silence like stones into still water, "meet your pilot for this afternoon's extraction mission." Major Harrison found his voice first, though it came out higher than usual. "Sir, with all due respect, Technical Sergeant Vasquez is assigned to fuel operations. She doesn't have current flight status or mission qualification for combat operations." Thorne had anticipated this objection, had spent the past 48 hours ensuring that his next words would be legally and procedurally unassailable. Technical Sergeant Vasquez holds a current airman's license with rotary wing certification. Her flight physical is valid, her psychological evaluation is current, and she has completed all required continuation training through self-study programs. Additionally, she has specific operational experience in the exact threat environment we're facing today. The room erupted in whispered conversations as staff officers tried to process what they were hearing. A fuel technician being assigned as mission pilot for a high-risk extraction was unprecedented, possibly illegal, and definitely the kind of decision that could end careers if it went wrong. But Thorne had done his homework, had spent 2 sleepless nights reviewing regulations, consulting with the staff judge advocate, and exploring every possible avenue that might allow him to put Elena Vasquez back in the cockpit where she belonged. What he had found was a narrow but legally defensible path through the bureaucratic maze that kept good people from doing what they did best. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused conversations, "in accordance with Emergency Personnel Utilization Directive 77 Alpha, I am temporarily reassigning Technical Sergeant Vasquez to flight operations for the duration of this mission, with all appropriate authorizations and responsibilities." Captain Rodriguez, who had been conspicuously quiet during the exchange, stepped forward with a manila folder containing documents that had been prepared with the kind of thoroughness that suggested careful legal review. "All paperwork has been filed and approved through appropriate channels, sir. Sergeant Vasquez is cleared for immediate flight operations. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that went far beyond a single mission or a single pilot. Everyone in the room understood they were witnessing either a masterful example of creative leadership or a spectacular exercise in career suicide. The difference would depend entirely on what happened over the next few hours. Elena Vasquez had remained motionless throughout the exchange, her expression professionally neutral despite the chaos swirling around her. But Thorne caught the slight straightening of her shoulders, the subtle shift in her posture that suggested someone preparing to carry a weight they had not been allowed to bear for far too long. "Technical Sergeant," he said formally, "are you prepared to accept this assignment?" When she answered, her voice carried the steady confidence of someone who had never doubted her abilities, only the system's willingness to utilize them. "Yes, sir. I am ready to fly." The pre-flight inspection took place in unusual silence. Normally, the flight line buzzed with conversations between crew chiefs, pilots, and support personnel. But today the maintenance area around tail number 774 felt charged with tension that made casual chatter seem inappropriate. Elena Vasquez moved around the A-60 Black Hawk with systematic precision, her hands checking control surfaces, hydraulic connections, and engine components with the muscle memory of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Morrison, the aircraft's assigned pilot, stood nearby with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with barely concealed skepticism. He had been scheduled to fly this mission until Colonel Thorne's surprise announcement, and his displacement by a fuel technician, regardless of her background, clearly rankled his professional pride. "You know," Morrison said as Vasquez completed her inspection of the main rotor assembly, "I've been flying Black Hawks for 12 years. Never lost an aircraft, never left anyone behind, never had a mission failure due to pilot error." Vasquez continued her inspection without breaking rhythm, but Thorne caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested Morrison's words had found their target. "That's an impressive record, Chief," she replied evenly. "The Army needs pilots who can follow procedures and execute missions according to established parameters." "But," Morrison pressed, sensing the unspoken qualification in her response. "But this mission isn't about following procedures," she said, finally turning to face him directly. "This is about bringing 12 soldiers home alive from a situation that has already gone beyond anything in the standard playbook. Sometimes following procedures gets people killed." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Morrison had heard rumors about Vasquez's background, whispered conversations about classified missions and administrative punishment, but facing her now, seeing the quiet competence in her movements and the steady resolve in her voice, he found his skepticism wavering despite his professional resentment. Staff Sergeant Williams, the crew chief assigned to the mission, emerged from the cargo bay where he had been checking medical supplies and emergency equipment. Williams was a 15-year veteran who had flown with most of the pilots in the battalion, and his opinion carried weight among the enlisted aircrew. "Ma'am," he said to Vasquez, "I've heard you've got some experience in hot landing zones. Any particular preferences for defensive positioning or emergency procedures?" It was both a test and an olive branch, a way of acknowledging her claimed expertise while giving her an opportunity to demonstrate it. Vasquez understood the subtext and responded with the kind of specific, technical guidance that only came from hard-won experience. "Keep your medical kit accessible but secured against high-G maneuvers," she said without hesitation. "If we take fire on approach, we may need to execute evasive actions that will throw loose equipment around the cabin. Also, verify that the emergency beacon is functional and that you've got visual contact with the backup communication radio. If our primary systems get damaged, we'll need alternatives that don't depend on aircraft power." Williams nodded slowly, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine respect. These weren't textbook answers or theoretical considerations. They were the specific, practical details that separated pilots who had been in combat from pilots who had only trained for it. "Copy that, ma'am," he said. "Anything else?" "Yeah," Vasquez replied, securing the engine cowling with practiced efficiency. "If everything goes according to plan, we'll be on the ground for less than 3 minutes. But if everything doesn't go according to plan, be prepared for anything from extended ground operations to emergency medical procedures to defending the aircraft while I try to get her running again." This is the kind of mission where routine becomes a meaningless concept. Colonel Thorne approached the aircraft as the crew completed their preparations. He had spent the morning dealing with radio messages from higher command, responding to questions about his personnel decisions with the kind of diplomatic language that acknowledged concerns without admitting error. The mission had attracted attention at levels far above his pay grade, which meant that success or failure would be measured not just in lives saved or lost, but in career implications that could affect everyone involved. "Weather report shows clear skies and minimal wind," he announced as the crew gathered for final briefing. "Current intelligence indicates the insurgent anti-aircraft positions are concentrated in a 3-kilometer radius around the extraction point, with at least one confirmed mobile launcher that may have repositioned since yesterday's reconnaissance." He spread a tactical map on the aircraft's cargo ramp, using weights to hold it flat against the desert breeze. Red circles marked known or suspected enemy positions, while blue arrows indicated the planned approach and withdrawal routes that had been developed by the battalion intelligence staff. Standard procedure would call for a high-altitude approach, fast rope insertion, and immediate extraction, Thorne continued. However, given the surface-to-air threat, that approach puts the aircraft in the engagement envelope of at least 2 confirmed missile systems. Vasquez studied the map with the focused intensity of someone reading her own survival in the terrain features and tactical symbols. Her fingers traced potential flight paths, considering angles of approach, available cover, and the deadly mathematics of missile engagement zones. "Sir," she said after a moment, "this plan assumes the insurgents will behave predictably and remain in fixed positions. In my experience, enemy forces with this level of sophistication don't stay stationary when they know extraction operations are imminent." Morrison frowned. "So what do you suggest? We still have to get the team out, regardless of where the enemy positions himself." "We get creative," Vasquez replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested creativity in this context was a euphemism for tactics that existed outside the approved manual of operations. "We use the terrain, we use deception, and we remember that sometimes the best way to avoid getting shot down is to be somewhere the enemy doesn't expect you to be." The mission brief that followed was unlike anything Morrison or Williams had experienced in their combined 27 years of military aviation. Recon Team Bravo had been operating from a concealed observation post overlooking a valley system that intelligence analysts had identified as a major infiltration route for foreign fighters and weapons smuggling. Their mission was simple in concept but dangerous in execution: gather detailed information about enemy movement patterns, communication capabilities, and defensive positions that could be used to plan future operations in the region. For 3 days, the 12-man team had maintained perfect operational security. They had avoided detection, gathered valuable intelligence, and prepared for routine extraction that should have been no more complicated than a dozen previous missions. But the discovery of sophisticated anti-aircraft systems had transformed a routine operation into something that tested the limits of conventional tactical doctrine. "The problem," Captain Rodriguez explained as she displayed the latest intelligence updates, "is that we're dealing with an adaptive enemy who understands our standard procedures and has positioned himself to counter them. Traditional helicopter tactics assume a certain level of technological superiority and tactical predictability that may not apply in this situation." She changed the display to show intercepted communication transcripts, translated from Arabic and annotated with intelligence assessments of enemy capabilities and intentions. They know we're coming. They know approximately when we're coming. And they've positioned their anti-aircraft systems to cover the most obvious approach routes to the extraction point. So we don't use the obvious approach routes, Vasquez said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a solution rather than identifying a problem. We go where they don't expect us, when they don't expect us, using methods they haven't planned for. Morrison was still studying the tactical map, his pilot's eye calculating distances, fuel consumption, and the 100 other variables that determined whether a mission succeeded or failed. The extraction point is in the middle of open terrain, ma'am. There's no cover for unconventional approaches, and any deviation from standard flight paths puts us further into suspected missile engagement zones. That's assuming we use the designated extraction point, Vasquez replied. What if we don't? The suggestion fell into the briefing room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Changing extraction points meant modifying mission parameters that had been approved at the highest levels, coordination with ground forces that had been positioned according to specific plans, and communication with a recon team that was expecting pickup at predetermined coordinates. It also meant accepting responsibility for decisions that could save lives or cost them, depending on whether unconventional thinking proved to be innovative flexibility or dangerous recklessness. Colonel Thorne looked at the assembled officers and aircrew, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own internal struggle between institutional caution and operational necessity. This was the moment when leadership stopped being about following established procedures and started being about making choices that no manual could prepare you for. "Explain your alternative, technical sergeant," he said quietly. Vasquez moved to the map, her finger tracing a route that avoided the designated landing zone entirely. "We extract them from here," she said, pointing to coordinates approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the original point. "Terrain is more difficult, but it's outside the predicted engagement envelope of the known missile systems. More importantly, it's not where they're expecting us to be." The route she proposed was audacious in its complexity. Instead of a direct flight path, it involved following terrain features that would mask the aircraft's approach, using natural cover to avoid detection until the last possible moment, and executing precision flying that left no margin for error or mechanical failure. "That approach takes us through a canyon system that's barely wide enough for rotor clearance," Morrison observed, his tone suggesting this was a criticism rather than merely an observation. "Yes," Vasquez agreed. "It does, but it also takes us below the radar horizon until we're within 500 meters of the new extraction point. By the time they acquire us on sensors, we'll already be on the ground loading passengers." Williams, who had been quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, what happens if the recon team can't make it to the alternate extraction point? They've been in position for 3 days, probably low on water and supplies. Moving 2 kilometers across open terrain under potential enemy observation could compromise their mission.